Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure this morning to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Mr. Kevin O'Connell is someone I've known for several years now, and as you'll find out over the course of the morning, he's really in a very interesting position to do some pretty great things for this industry. Kevin is currently the Director of the Office of Space Commerce at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and in that position, he is responsible for being the space industry advocate within the executive branch of the U.S. government. His has long experience over the last 35 years, both inside U.S. government, outside in research organizations, and as an entrepreneur and business leader. Kevin's background is primarily in the remote sensing world. He's written extensively on policy, security, and market issues related to that topic, commercialization of remote sensing. He has provided expertise to both NOAA on the Federal Advisory Committee, as well as NEMA, serving on a commission to look at NEMA and how they need to reinvent some of the ways they do things. Before joining the government, he was the CEO of Innovative Analytics and Training, which was a professional services firm that focused on analysis and decision support for U.S. government and commercial clients. The important thing about his current role is, in addition to resurrecting this Office of Space Commerce that has sort of been dormant for the last several years, Kevin is being tasked with carrying out a large part of the Trump administration's policies for encouraging, promoting commercial space, as well as space situation awareness. So, Kevin, please.
Thank you, Brian, for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. I'm deeply honored to be with you at the AMOS conference, and thank you, Mahalo, for the invitation by the AMOS conference team. It seems, by a casual look at the calendar, it seems that every morning begins with a short policy talk, and I'll emphasize the word short there. You know, we're from Washington, we like policy things. And I'm not sure whether that's designed to just ease you into the day gently or to shock you into more technical conversations. So as Brian said, I'm the new director of the Office of Space Commerce. We're currently in week 9 in the job. Our office sits within NOAA, and I'd like to start by giving a shout out to NOAA for the work that they do every day on hurricanes, on tropical storms. The imagery from the GOES, the advanced GOES satellites, is actually spectacular and has created the opportunity for earlier state of emergency declarations and literally saving lives. And so very thankful for that. I know that NOAA has a special relationship with Maui and Hawaii in general, and so we're very thankful for that. I'd also be remiss if I didn't bring greetings from my boss, Secretary Wilbur Ross. The Secretary cut back his trip to Europe in order to get home for emergency preparations related to the hurricane. Otherwise, he might be standing at this podium. He's very excited about space issues, as you know. His leadership has energized the department in ways not seen for a very, very long time. People say, why commerce? It has always been in the imagination of both policy and policymakers that commerce play an important role in the commercialization of space. That's not a new idea. You can go back to the Reagan administration, even earlier than that, to see the ideas that relate to this. Ours is an agency whose role in commercial space was long envisioned and is long overdue. So my office, the Office of Space Commerce, is not a new office, but we're in the process of revitalizing it after almost a decade. The Secretary, of course, is committed to elevating the office to his level so that it can serve as a one-stop shop on behalf of commercial industry. Beyond the reestablishment of the National Space Council and the early space policy directives, this is another reflection of the Trump administration's emphasis on space, and specifically on U.S. commercial space as an important source of innovation and economic benefit to the nation. And by the way, if you've kept your eyes on the National Space Council's deliberations, they're very much about getting things done. You know, these quarterly meetings that we have really attempt to keep the process moving within the government. Within the office, we have 4 elements of our strategy in order to, quote, foster conditions for the economic growth and technological advancement of the U.S. commercial industry. And I'll just list them here. We can talk about them more in the questions if you'd like. They are advocacy, both at home and abroad, removing regulatory barriers, industry engagement, and better explaining and analyzing the impact of space on Earth. And so, for example, as we improve our SSA and STM capabilities, this will enhance the environment within which space commerce can thrive, and along the way allow for the creation of applications that affect our lives on Earth. It's sometimes hard for us to remember how much space affects our lives on Earth every single day, and that's one of the small initiatives that I'll have within the office. So let me say it right from the start of my conversation with you. U.S. commercial enterprises will play an important key role in transforming our SSA and STM capabilities. Why? Because of the confluence of national leadership, technology, and finance that is driving space innovation very, very quickly and related developments on the ground. Because related advancements in sensors, analytics, visualization, and decision support aids create the opportunity to do it. And most importantly, because the need to understand activity in space is growing every single day based on U.S. strategic and economic interests. The high-speed growth of the global space economy, today evaluated at roughly $350 billion, but headed quickly to $1 trillion, some would say more, 2,000 to potentially 20,000 satellites in space, will absolutely critically depend on the rapid modernization and improvement of the SSA and STM architectures that exist today. U.S. companies are already demonstrating innovation and potential improvements that will not only create commercial value, but elevate the entire U.S. national enterprise to a new level. The question on your minds, of course, is how quickly and efficiently we can involve industry in this transformation. We have brought together the many agencies of commerce, many that you probably don't even know about, the Office of Business Liaison, the Economic Development Agency, a whole host of others that I'll mention as I go through my remarks, to address this under Space Policy Directive 3 on the reorganization of space traffic management. The Department is also working closely with other federal agencies under the whole of government strategy. That's a very important concept that the Space Council has put forward, to work through a wide range of issues to help modernize and improve the current system. Even as the U.S. government works to improve current capabilities and basic services, we're seeking different ways to bring industry to help improve SSA and STM approaches and create brand new ones. If it sounds a bit like flying the airplane while improving it, it is. The limitations of the current system are well known and have been discussed extensively already. We monitor a small fraction of space debris, and the catalog is incomplete. Two-line element notices lack key information and contain occasional error. Modern analytic approaches, visualization techniques, and dissemination methods have not yet been applied. We had a good conversation yesterday about overarching goals for space situational awareness and space traffic management. I think that's one that we need to continue on. Operationally, of course, our goal is to reduce the risk of collision, including reductions in the number of false alarms. Very important. Among the strategic benefits that General Whiting talked about yesterday, we can imagine how improved SSA and STM affects the entire value chain for space, including for enabling industries like space finance and space insurance. Under SPD 3, the Department is working actively with the Department of Defense and other federal agencies to expand research on SSA and STM, to improve current operations, and to engage industry and academia on new approaches to monitoring space debris, provide warning and better predictive capabilities, and to create other ways to increase confidence on the part of satellite operators. But this is a dynamic problem, of course, as this audience knows full well, as plans for larger satellite constellations create a more crowded environment and risk of additional debris. Satellite maneuvers may become more common based on mission and commercial activities. Over time, this increased awareness that we will create will also create conditions for adjacent markets in satellite servicing as well as space debris removal. The Department is tasked under SPD 3 to create a civil SSA agency that will be responsible for civil and commercial notifications. How will it work? The Department of Defense will continue to hold the authoritative catalog, while the Department of Commerce will create a storefront, if you will, for providing SSA notifications to civil and commercial users. One major part of the Department's responsibilities will be to create an open architecture data repository that starts with the DoD catalog and enables a host of innovative capabilities and data sets provided by industry, academia, and allies and partners. You heard General Whiting say yesterday, build your apps on top of my catalog. The repository is likely to be a very important source of innovation. Within our early discussions, we hope to draw on state-of-the-art data management and data sharing capabilities, such as those available broadly within cloud computing, and allow for experimentation as new data sources and algorithms become available. There are important policy and technical questions about data fusion. We had a good session yesterday on data strategy, but we will strive to create maximum opportunities for exploration, curation, and collaboration within these data sets. These will serve not only as potential sources of innovation for the U.S. government, but also as the source of new service offerings for global markets, commercial service offerings. One path that we're exploring already is the role that the Commerce Department's National Technical Information Service might play here. NTIS, probably an organization you're not that familiar with, provides innovative data services to U.S. government agencies through joint venture partnerships with the private sector. We also need your help in understanding standards, emerging standards and best practices both at home and abroad. An August 2018 aerospace paper entitled U.S. Space Traffic Management, Best Practices, Guidelines, Standards, and International Considerations noted, quote, that there are no widely embraced, and I think the key here is widely, compulsory or integrated standards, best practices, or guidelines focused on mitigating risks in space. The paper does go on to highlight different organizations and standards that are adopted in a narrower way. Standards, of course, form the basis for safe and responsible behavior in space, and they make future space participants more efficient in how they approach the market. U.S. government incorporation of emerging capabilities into its own architecture will rely heavily on new standards on issues ranging from sensor validation to analytic methods and others. Within the Department of Commerce, of course, we have the National Institutes for Technology and Standard, which is the government's agency to help establish standards, and so they're being brought into the fight at this point. Even as commercial industry advances, the U.S. government agencies will remain deeply engaged in research, in improving operations, and engaging international partners. My colleague Dick Beneke will be here tomorrow to talk about that latter point. The key will be leveraging the most important developments from government, industry, and academia as the mission improves, expands, and even diversifies to meet a wider range of needs in the trillion-dollar space economy. For example, some of you may have seen Pam Melroy's excellent self-published article recently. The government's exquisite data will be combined with a more diverse set of commercial data to improve the certainty around space debris and other activities, as just one small example of that. The SSA-STM mission also lends itself to the provisions of Space Policy Directive 2 on streamlining commercial regulations on the use of space. We're planning an international conference in Washington in very early 2019 to talk about commercial involvement in this mission, including the impacts of regulation. Finally, my entry into this world, as Brian mentioned, came about 25 years ago when I was working for the Director of Central Intelligence on the commercialization of satellite imagery. The veterans in the room may remember something called PDD-23. That was actually one of the major milestones in establishing commercialization principles for satellite imagery. While the parallels are not perfect, there is some familiarity, at least in my mind, between that case and the case of SSA-STM. It's much more than imagery looking down and SSA looking up. The technology and business contexts are very different and the need more urgent for many different reasons. Let me stay on this for a minute. Doug, you asked a question yesterday about the possible application of NextView and NGA's contractual mechanisms, business mechanisms to deal with the private sector. I think those are interesting parallels, actually. And in my mind, there are also parallels from the commercial weather community and how that has emerged. And so we're not without some precedent here on how to make these things go at least a little bit faster. Those will all be explored, as well as the excellent work that goes on here in the AMOS community. In closing, I believe that we're in the forefront of a new age in SSA and STM, one that will be absolutely critical to the trillion-dollar economy, space economy, and the properly ambitious goals that the United States has for low Earth orbit and for space exploration to the moon and beyond. Those goals cannot be reached without the robust participation of the private sector, and the Department of Commerce and other U.S. government agencies are working intensely to find the pathways for that to happen. And so with that, I'll stop and I'll look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin.
Sure.
So as a reminder, if you'd like to ask a question, please log on to sif.ly. Should be up there on the screen in a minute. The code is AMOS 18, and send in your question, and we'll get it through to ask question to Kevin. I have a couple I want to start with. One, so SPD 3 is directing you to stand up this civil SSA, starting and leveraging with the DoD, existing DoD capabilities. How have those initial conversations with the DoD gone? And so what do you see as the way you're going to think about that transition?
So we've had some excellent discussions, interactions, exchanges, if you will, with DoD. Spent some time out at Vandenberg. We actually took them to the DOC campus up in Boulder, Colorado. Again, maybe less familiar to many in the room, to essentially sort of show folks different kinds of capabilities. I think we're on the hook for a very near-term plan to the White House on what our plan will be collectively for these two agencies specifically to work together. So very thrilled. General Whiting's team at Vandenberg and others have been very, very cooperative on this.
So you mentioned two different policy directives, Space Policy Directive 2, which mainly is about modernizing regulation of commercial space activities, and then Space Policy Directive 3, which is about space traffic management. You've been tasked under both, your office.
That's correct.
And so you've been tasked both with modernizing the way we do licensing for remote sensing and dealing with new things, as well as civil SSA. A, how are you going to do all that? And B, what do you see as the interplay between those two taskings?
Sure. So on the first, we actually have the Secretary's endorsement to, as I said, revitalize the office. That will be bringing in some staff, but not a large staff. We want a lean and efficient capability inside the department. The other thing I have the advantage of is I'm able to tap into something that preceded me at Commerce. It's about a 25 to 30 person space team that actually reaches every corner of the department. And so backed by the enthusiasm of the Secretary and the senior leadership, I've been able to go out and reach out to the International Trade Administration or OBL, et cetera. So we want to build a cadre in the office, a small cadre, who can help orchestrate all of the Commerce Department's roles on that. Remind me of the second part of your question again. Oh, two and three
exactly,
together.
the interplay between the regulatory reform and the space traffic management.
So I think the regulatory reform piece, the first action out of the gate, obviously, is the review of the remote sensing regulations. And that's well underway. Public comment period is over. What I'm really seeking, though, and again, welcome input from this audience, I'm trying to find ways in which regulation can actually keep close to rapid changes in technology and business models. I was kidding with Brian before. I ran the public meeting in, I think, April 2001 for the current set of regulations that we have in remote sensing. And so how do we even stay close in a world which is really modernizing and changing very, very quickly? So beyond that specific action, we're looking at broader, I'll call them more structural ways to think about regulation, especially as new capabilities come to market. I think part of that is we have to be able to anticipate faster, better, what capabilities are coming for commercialization. Because if you show up for a license on something and that's the first day the government says, gee, let me think about that, it's way too late, okay? And so how do we anticipate capabilities that are come forward in the market? Sorry, you've got me.
No, that's excellent. Okay. So a couple questions in the audience here. One, in your opinion, should SSA data and services be a public good, or are they a public good? And what's that balance between the private aspect of it and the publicly available aspect of it?
So a very important question. Thank you for the question. There is certainly an aspect that will always be a public good. And so we've had discussions over the last couple of days about how much data should be made free. Again, not unlike some discussions we've had in the imagery world over the years. Okay, I will say this, for public safety missions, The U.S. government will always reserve the right to release or provide some data free, really mostly to avoid cataclysmic problems in space. Okay. But I think that's the set of discussions we have to have. I think there is, in some of our early discussions, we've heard sort of this naive view that the DoD catalog is what it is and will stay that way forever. That's not correct. That is absolutely not correct. It will improve as well, but so will our concept of what becomes the basic services that are provided for free. Again, in an emergency, all bets are off. Other than that, that's one of the things I think we have to grapple with.
You've talked about, you've had this direction from the White House, the administration, about the new initiatives. What level of congressional support have you been seeing in terms of legislation to give you those authorities and the funding levels?
So we have both. We've engaged both in the House and the Senate side. Obviously, I got this job partly because of testimony I gave before the House Science Committee in 2016. I think some of the first issues out of the box are some of the smaller ones, not small, but smaller, on the office and how it interacts with the rest of the department. There are larger issues on mission authorization under SPD2, as directed by SPD2, on the kinds of things that we will be able to regulate or provide authorization for in the future.
So you mentioned that your Department of Commerce has been tasked to develop a data repository, but SPD3 also says the DoD is going to maintain the authoritative catalog.
Sure.
The question here is, does that risk potentially having two different catalogs, and how do you see those potentially interacting, understanding you are just starting to think about how you might do this, right?
So I think, again, the way we're thinking about it in these early days is that the DoD catalog will be the foundation of what's done. And what I'd like to do from my position is to look at creating, as I said, a truly state-of-the-art open architecture data repository. We obviously have a set of sensitive, large volume data. So do other communities in the medical field and the banking field, where those kinds of systems have been created and are readily available. And so we will find a path at that point to bring in the DoD catalog, but also allow the kind of innovation that we've talked about. We had a conversation in a session yesterday about different watches and different catalogs and things like that. We're still thinking about that in terms of, is it a single catalog? How will one catalog affect the other? We'll sort all that out.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned removing regulatory barriers as a goal for your office. There's a question here about, can you give a couple of specific examples about barriers you're trying to reduce, or some certainty you're trying to give to industry?
Sure. Again, the active case is on the remote sensing licensing. We've just closed that, the public comment period on that, and so we'll be revising the regulations to allow for the new set of phenomena that are coming into the market, the new business models are coming into the market. That's certainly one. You may have noticed NOAA has made progression on the commercial weather data pilot. I think there'll be an announcement fairly soon on that. How will we allow companies to come in? And let me stop for a minute on the commercial weather case, because the historic example on the weather case was anything that NOAA received under WMO 40 had to be released anything that NOAA received in the commercial sector had to be released automatically under provisions of WMO 40, the World Meteorological arrangements that they are party to. I think over time we've seen people recognize how to keep some piece of that pertinent to WMO 40, but also allow companies to maintain aspects of their data that are truly proprietary, around which they should be able to make a business.
And I think on the remote sensing case, I think I recall that they've already brought the average time to a license down from something like 200 days down to much less than that.
Yeah, the whole issue of NOAA gets great credit for its pre-consultation on licenses, and so if you're thinking about putting a remote sensing license, the earlier you come in for discussions, the better off you are. I don't know that that's particularly a regulatory issue, but modernizing the way that people can submit licenses, get feedback, et cetera, those are certainly part of our review right now as well.
So there's a couple of questions in here that relate to the international aspect of this. I'm going to see if I can tie them together in a two-parter. The first part is, you are part of the U.S. government tasked with developing U.S. policy and regulation, but there's an international piece of this. So how do you see the international aspect of the space traffic management SSA piece that you're working on?
Sure. So again, I'm sure Dick tomorrow will talk about how we're bringing our partners and allies into the SPD3 provisions. And so I don't know what more to say about that actually at this point.
Okay.
Just that we see them being part of the conversation as well, or part of the conversation here.
Let me rephrase. I think, if I recall from SPD3, the strategy was develop a U.S. approach to this and then work to promulgate that internationally?
Absolutely.
Is that?
So it's to develop the architecture for the United States case, but along the way, understand whether there are international best practices that are worthy of adoption there, but also keeping in mind all the time that we'll want to share data with our partners and allies.
And so that's the second part, which I think you just answered. Somebody else asked, might SSA collaboration be a way to build partnerships between countries that are not traditionally U.S. allies and people we engage with?
Sure.
And I think we're already seeing that a little bit from
Absolutely.
General Whiting's discussion yesterday.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. I think one final question here, I would say, there's a question here, is there a new national space policy coming down the pike? And I'll expand that to say, are there additional space policy initiatives that you can talk about that the Trump administration is working on?
So we have plenty of work to do, and as I mentioned, we're under the gun to make rapid progress against SPDs 2 and 3. You can envision an SPD 4 at some point. I'm not at liberty to say much more about that. So I don't know that I see any top-level review of national space policy, but again, there's plenty of work to be done within the work that we're doing right now.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Kevin.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.